The broadcast from the death world. The jungle had a voice that never slept. It hissed through wet leaves and old roots and the empty rib cages of things that had hunted and failed. Under a broken moon, the trees leaned like tall judges, and a hard rain tapped the canopy in a steady beat. Far above, silent drones hovered on blue rings of light, their lenses open, their feeds clean, their captions already rolling in 10 languages across a billion screens. The show's name glowed in a corner of every broadcast. Sovereign Wild. Live Kai Mercer stood in the long grass with his hands open and his chest lifting and falling in deep, even pulls. He wore a torn flight jacket and a length of paracord looped at his belt. Mud streaked his forearms. There was no blade in his grip, no gun, no armor. He watched the tree line the way a sailor watches a dark wave, and he listened with his whole body for the snap of a twig or the hush of breath that was not his own. The commentators spoke in calm tones that did not match the heat in the air. Their words slid out to the galaxy like a surgeon's report. The human is cornered near the basalt shelf. Apex signature closing from the east. Dreadmaw adult. Mass index red. Watch for the charge. The audience posted their little bursts of text and bright icons. Most came to see death like a sport. Some wanted to learn something true. Many just wanted noise to fill the room while their ships crossed the long dark between stars. The first warning was the smell. A hot iron scent, like blood that had met sunlight. Then the grass flattened from nowhere and a body low to the ground moved with a speed that made the drones refocus. The Dreadmaw slid into view with a glide that had no extra motion. Its hide was a deep slate color that shone like wet stone. 6 limbs, all power. A mouth that hinged too far and showed a rim of pale, crushing plates instead of teeth. Its eyes were small and set back, covered by a clear second lid that blinked side to side. Kai did not run. He shifted his weight until his heels found the friction of the basalt behind him. He was not stronger than the beast and he knew it, but he had watched river ice carry whole trees into gaps and split them like dry sticks. He had watched men in his old unit move things they had no right to move because a wall or an angle turned a fight into a machine with a clean answer. He set his back to the rock and lowered his center until his thighs burned and his toes dug into the wet ground. The Dreadmaw swayed and showed a slice of pale plates. It let out a rumble that came from its chest and the ground together, and then it came in fast and low with a feint and a pivot that would have taken a leg if he had guessed wrong. Kai stepped in instead of back. He slammed his forearm across the side of its head to redirect the mouth as it opened. The plate scraped his skin and took hair and a line of blood. He did not think about the pain. He kept moving. He reached for the joint under the front limb where a thick band of muscle met a bony ridge. His fingers locked like a vice. He drove his shoulder under the limb and twisted his hips with all the weight he could bring. The beast bucked and whipped its tail and hit him across the back so hard that light flashed in his eyes. He grunted and rode the movement into the rock. Stone met hide. The impact shook his teeth. He felt the limb slacken and then seize again. He did not let go. The second drone dropped lower. The commentators went quiet. The audience feed started to fill with short messages that lost their humor. Kai found the second anchor point with his knee braced against the rock. He used the beast's own push to climb half onto its neck. His left hand slid along wet hide until his palm found the hinge under the jaw, where the plates met a pad of softer tissue. He dug in with all 5 fingers. He hooked the edge with his thumb. He pulled the jaw across the line of its own power so the hinge could not close. The Dreadmaw thrashed and slammed him into the basalt again. The rock tore his jacket and opened his shoulder. He tasted copper and rain. He kept his breath slow so his hands did not shake. He had learned long ago that fear would make the hands fast and weak. He needed slow and strong. He pressed his forearm across the upper jaw and leaned his whole weight into a steady pry. The hinge creaked. The clear inner lid flicked hard over the eye. The beast tried to roll and crush him, but the rock would not give and neither did he. He felt the first small tear like a string breaking in a knot that had been wet for a long time. He took that as a signal and gave it everything. He planted his feet, one on the rock and one on the beast's rib plate. He pulled with his back and his legs more than with his arms. The jaw opened past the point it should open. The soft pad split. Warmth ran over his hand and wrist. He felt the hinge stretch and then snap with a clean, wet sound that the drones caught and sent across the stars. The Dreadmaw's body bucked and then lost shape. Its forelimbs scrabbled at the ground and found no plan. It made a high, thin noise that living things make when a plan inside them fails. Kai shoved the lower jaw down and aside, grabbed the back of the skull ridge with both hands, and twisted hard to roll the head into the ground. The neck gave under the force, and the weight of the body worked against itself. The movement was simple and final. The beast went still except for a last shake of muscle under the hide. Kai stayed there for a moment, with both palms on wet slate skin, and his breath steady and heavy. He was shaking now that it was done. His shoulder burned and his back felt like it had been struck with a hammer. He looked up at the nearest drone and stared into its dark lens as if it were a person. He did not raise his arms or shout. He just stood and let the jungle sound come back in and fill all the holes that the fight had carved out of the air in households and barracks and booths across the galaxy. People who had tuned in for easy thrills leaned forward and tried to swallow, with dry mouths. Some forgot to breathe for a long moment. On a gunship crossing a cold drift, a mercenary captain paused the feed and rewound and watched the hinge break again and did not speak. In a quiet office with a view of a city of mirrors, a counselor reached for a glass and set it, down with a hand that was not steady. In a lab on a moon wrapped in storms, a young scientist whispered that the model was wrong. Kai cleaned his hands on his torn jacket. He tested his shoulder and hissed once and rolled it until the pain moved to a place he could live with. He tied the paracord around his upper arm to slow the blood, and then he listened again. The jungle spoke in the same old voice. Above him, the drones adjusted and hummed. Far away, thunder walked across the sky. He did not know yet that the moment would ring like a bell in the halls of men who sold danger for money. He only knew he was still alive and the night was not done. The jungle was alive with noise and breath and danger, a place where every leaf hid teeth and every shadow carried weight. It was night, the broken moon scattering its pale light through the trees, and the air was thick with rain and mud. Somewhere above, silent drones floated with steady humming rings of blue, their cameras open to the galaxy, streaming the hunt to billions who had tuned in for another night of sovereign wild. The show was the Empire's favorite blood sport, a spectacle where apex predators clashed with prey in their natural world. But tonight the prey was different. A lone human named Kai Mercer stood among the grass, his hands open and steady, his chest rising with slow measured breaths. He had no blade in his grip, no rifle, no armor. His jacket was torn, mud clung to his arms, and blood stained his skin from earlier cuts, yet his eyes were calm and fixed on the dark edge of the tree line. He was waiting. The commentators' voices drifted across the broadcast in smooth, detached tones, as if they were describing a card game, and not life or death. They told their unseen audience that the human had been cornered against a basalt ridge, that the apex signature of a Dreadmaw was closing in, and that the odds of survival were near zero. Across the galaxy, ships, cities, and stations buzzed, with people watching. Some laughed and placed wagers, expecting the human to be torn apart. Some leaned forward with curiosity, unsure of what this strange species from a forgotten world might show. Others simply wanted noise to fill the silence of deep space, but all of them were about to see something that would stay in their minds long after the feed ended. The first warning did not come from sound, but from smell. A metallic heat rolled across the rain, heavy air, sharp like iron, the scent of blood and predator breath. Then the grass shifted low to the ground, pushed by a weight moving with speed that seemed impossible. A shape slid into view, not lunging yet, but prowling with deadly grace. The Dreadmaw was massive, 6 limbs holding a body of pure muscle and slate-colored hide that shone like wet stone under the moonlight. Its mouth opened wide on a hinge too large, showing pale, crushing plates instead of teeth, and its eyes blinked, with a clear inner lid. It was a nightmare shaped for hunting, a beast that had killed everything it ever stalked. The galaxy watching knew it. Kai knew it too, but he did not run. Instead, he pressed his back to the basalt, set his heels in the mud and lowered his stance until his legs burned with the strain. He was not stronger than the beast, but he had learned long ago that strength was not enough. Walls could redirect waves, angles could split trees, and a man with leverage could move what should not move. He let the rock behind him become his ally. He drew a slow breath and fixed his eyes on the predator. The dreadmaw swayed and then lunged. It came in low, its plates glinting, its roar rising from chest to ground. It feinted left, then snapped right with a strike that would have torn off his leg if he had stepped back. But Kai stepped forward instead. He drove his forearm across the side of its head, forcing the plates away from his body. The scrape tore his skin and drew blood, but he did not yield. He slid under the limb, found the joint where muscle met bone, and locked his fingers in like iron. He twisted with his hips, not only his arms, and drove the beast's own weight into the rock. The impact cracked against the night, shaking his teeth, but it gave him the angle he needed. The beast bucked and struck him with its tail, a blow that made light flash in his vision. But he held on. His knee braced against the ridge. His shoulder pressed under the limb. His body became a lever. With his free hand, he clawed up the beast's neck until he found the soft hinge under the jaw. His fingers dug deep, his thumb hooked into the seam of flesh. He pressed down, forcing the hinge sideways against its own power. The dreadmaw thrashed, smashing him against stone, cutting his jacket and shoulder open, but his breath stayed slow, his grip steady. He knew fear made hands weak and fast. He needed slow, he needed strong. There was a tearing sound, like a knot breaking. He planted his feet, one on the rock, one against the beast's ribs, and pulled with all the strength of his back and legs. The hinge snapped with a wet crack that made the drones refocus and the galaxy fall silent. The jaw opened past its natural limit, flesh tearing, blood spilling hot across his hands. The dreadmaw cried out in a high, strange sound, its limbs scraping, helplessly, its body failing its own design. Kai twisted the head into the ground, using its weight against itself, and with one last motion the neck gave way. The monster lay still, its body twitching once and then falling silent against the stone. For a moment Kai did not move. His palms stayed on its hide, his breath heavy and ragged, his body shaking from the force he had spent. Pain burned in his shoulder, his back throbbed from the strikes, and blood ran down his arm. He looked up at the drone hovering close, its lens dark and round like an eye, and stared into it without a word. He did not raise his arms in triumph. He did not shout. He simply stood steady in the rain, letting the jungle sound return around him across the stars. Silence fell where there had been noise. Viewers who had laughed were quiet. Soldiers replayed the moment again and again in disbelief. Politicians spilled their drinks. Scientists whispered that the models had been wrong. Fear and awe spread in equal measure. The galaxy had just seen a human kill with bare hands what no soldier dared face with weapons, and they would never forget it. The storm passed over the jungle slowly, leaving broken branches and dripping leaves in its wake. Smoke from lightning-struck trees curled into the night sky while the drones continued to follow their subject with silent precision. The feed never ended, and billions of eyes stayed fixed on the figure of the human who had just done what none of them believed possible. Kai Mercer had killed a dreadmaw with his bare hands. The moment replayed in countless households, barracks, and council halls across the galaxy. To some, it was entertainment taken too far. To others, it was revelation and threat. The networks clipped the footage into short bursts, the sound of bone snapping, the human's steady breath, the predator's final cry. These clips spread like wildfire, copied, shared, and studied frame by frame. In places of power, the mood shifted from curiosity to unease. On the bridge of a mercenary gunship orbiting a cold red world, Captain Thrix leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tusked jaw while the footage looped on the holo. His crew muttered to one another, some cursing, some laughing nervously. Thrix silenced them with a hand. He had fought wars. He had seen cybernetically enhanced soldiers rip through armor. But he had never seen one unarmed being overpower a predator of that size. He knew what his employers would think. If one human could do that, then trained squads of them would be nightmares on any battlefield. His message to the syndicate was simple. Capture that human alive. Alive, he repeated. Dead, he was a curiosity. Alive, he was profit beyond measure, in a council chamber built of glass and steel. Counselor Vina of the Galactic Corps replayed the same moment with pale fingers trembling on the controls. Around her, aides whispered about propaganda and instability. The Empire could not afford another unpredictable species rising in strength. For centuries, humans had been marked as fringe survivors from a hostile cradle world, too primitive to be a danger, too few to matter. That assumption had just cracked apart in front of billions of viewers. Vina pressed her glass to her lips, then lowered it untouched. If the Syndicate did not control this, the Council would have to act. She felt fear in her gut, and fear always led to violent policy. In a research lab on a storm-swept moon, young scientist Orion kept watching the humans' movements with wide eyes. He slowed the footage, studying the angles of force, the way the man had turned the Predator's power into weakness, the way he had endured pain with control rather than panic. Orion whispered that their models of human biology were incomplete, that the nervous system and muscle structure were doing things beyond expectation. His supervisor dismissed him, saying it was only luck, only spectacle. Orion did not believe that. He saved the feed to his private archive, knowing there was more to learn, perhaps more than the galaxy wanted to admit. Meanwhile, down on the jungle floor, Kai Mercer tightened the cord around his arm to slow the bleeding from his shoulder. Wound. His breaths came steady but deep, his muscles sore and heavy. He scanned the tree line again. He knew the fight was over, but not the danger. The drones hummed above, recording every step, every gesture, every look. He hated them now more than the predator he had killed. The beast had been honest, shaped by nature to kill and to die. The drones belonged to men who fed on fear and suffering for profit. He picked up a broken branch, tested its weight, and tossed it aside. No use. He needed more than wood. He needed to think like the soldier he had been before all this began. Far away in hidden chambers, the Syndicate's leaders met in shadow. They were not pleased that the human had survived, but they were thrilled at the attention it had drawn. Ratings surged beyond expectation. Bets poured in by the trillions of credits, and the feeds were the only thing people talked about. They decided the show could not stop now. They would release more predators, push the human into deadlier encounters, and let the galaxy watch him rise or fall. If he died, they would profit. If he survived, they would profit more. To guarantee the spectacle, they placed a secret bounty through mercenary channels. The human was not to be killed outright, but captured, trained, and sold back into the cycle again and again. Sovereign Wild would have its star back in the jungle. Kai crouched near a shallow pool to clean his wounds. The cold water stung as he washed away blood and dirt. He saw his reflection for a moment, face sharp with exhaustion, eyes hard from years of war and loss, yet there was still calm there. He thought of his unit, of the men and women who had stood beside him on Earth's far battlefields, of the promise he had made never to let himself be used again. He did not know the galaxy watched him now, not as a man but as an image, a symbol, a weapon. He only knew survival. 1 hour into the next, lightning flashed again in the distance, and the call of another predator echoed across the wet trees. Kai stood and rolled his sore shoulder. He whispered to himself that he had survived worse and he would survive this too. The drones shifted to follow. The commentary rolled on, and across the stars the galaxy leaned closer to see what would come next. The morning in the jungle came heavy with mist, turning every tree into a towering ghost and every shadow into a threat. Kai Mercer rose from where he had rested against the roots of an ancient tree, his muscles stiff, his wounds still raw, but his mind alert. The jungle never gave peace for long. Already the buzzing of drones circled above, watching, waiting, feeding the galaxy with images of his every move. He felt their gaze like a weight pressing on his shoulders. He hated that his fight was not private, that every choice he made was for the amusement of strangers. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the canopy. The drones shifted away, but never stopped recording. He knew now that he was not just surviving. He was being hunted for a purpose larger than his own life, not far away. Poachers hired by the Syndicate swept through the undergrowth. They were not natural hunters of the jungle, but men armed with scanners and cages. Men who saw the human as a prize worth more than the predators themselves. They moved with nervous energy, whispering to each other about the bonus they would earn if they captured the human alive. They had seen the footage too, and part of them feared him, but greed outweighed fear. Their weapons hummed with tranquilizer darts, their nets glimmered with energy fields, and they advanced slowly, trying to drive him into a trap. Kai had already sensed them. The jungle spoke to him through sound and movement. A snapped twig here, the faint smell of power cells there. He crouched low and moved silently, using the mist and trees to cover his shape. He had fought trained soldiers before, and he knew these were not of the same kind. They were careless, thinking of their prize rather than their safety. He came upon one near a snare line, a small alien trapped in the net, writhing and crying out with high, thin sounds. Kai stepped forward, and with one hard motion he broke the snare apart, pulling the little creature free. The alien stared at him with wide eyes, not understanding why a predator would show mercy. The drones caught it all, broadcasting not just violence but a moment of compassion. Across the stars, millions who had watched with horror now whispered to each other that the human was not just brutal, but also capable of unexpected kindness. The poachers closed in. Kai knew he could run deeper into the jungle, but something in him refused. Running meant they would keep coming, keep turning the world into a cage. Instead, he decided to use the jungle as his weapon. He guided the rescued alien to a hollow beneath the roots, motioned for silence, and then climbed up into the wet branches above. From there, he watched the hunters spread below, nets raised, scanners glowing. He remembered lessons from his unit back on Earth, where survival meant not facing force head-on but bending it until it broke under its own weight. He waited until the first man passed beneath his branch, then dropped down with the force of gravity on his side. He struck hard and silent, taking the man down before the others noticed. The drones recorded, the galaxy gasped, and already the legend grew. The rest of the poachers fired wild, their darts hissing through the air, striking trees and leaves, but not him. Kai moved with the rhythm of the jungle, slipping behind trunks, forcing them to chase, drawing them deeper into terrain that confused their senses. One fell into a pit of thorns left by predators. Another found his net tangled in his own limbs. One by one they lost their advantage until only two remained, frightened now, whispering to each other that the human was a monster shaped by the death world itself. Kai did not kill them. He struck with precision, leaving them unconscious but alive, their weapons useless in the mud. He knew that mercy would confuse them more than death. The galaxy would see that too, far above. The commentators scrambled to explain what was happening. They called him unpredictable, dangerous, yet strangely honorable. They warned that he was not only surviving but resisting the very system of the show. The syndicate executives watched with narrowed eyes, furious that their hunters had failed, yet delighted by the surge in ratings. The story of the human was no longer just survival. It was rebellion, and rebellion always sold well. They decided to raise the stakes, to release more predators, to drive him harder, to break him or make him into the greatest spectacle Sovereign Wild had ever known. Kai returned to the hollow where the small alien waited. He crouched and offered it a piece of fruit from the tree above. The creature hesitated, then took it, trembling but grateful. In that quiet moment, Kai felt something stir inside him, the faint memory of fighting not just for his own life but for others. The war on Earth had taught him loss, but it had also taught him that survival meant nothing without purpose. He looked to the sky where the drones hovered, and for the first time he understood that his fight was no longer about escape. It was about sending a message to all who watched, a message that he would not be broken, that he would not be owned. The jungle was his stage, but he would decide the story. The day wore on and the jungle grew hotter, steam rising from the wet ground, until every breath felt heavy with water. Kai Mercer moved through the dense trees with his shoulders tense and his eyes always scanning. He carried no weapon but the broken staff he had carved from a branch, more a walking support than a blade, yet in his hands it became something more. The small alien he had freed followed him at a distance, still afraid but unwilling to leave the strange human who had spared its life. The drones circled above in constant silence, their glowing rings steady, their lenses capturing every step. The galaxy did not look away. The human had become more than prey. He had become a story unfolding before all who watched in the cities of the core. People gathered in crowded halls where massive screens replayed his every move. Merchants sold trinkets shaped like predators, and bets ran higher than ever. But under the surface, voices of doubt began to rise. Some whispered that the human was not an animal, but a warrior who should never have been thrown into the spectacle. Others argued he was too dangerous to be left alive. The syndicate fed these whispers with edited clips, turning his mercy into defiance, his cunning into rebellion, and his survival into challenge. They needed the audience hooked and fearful, and nothing pulled tighter than the idea of a creature from a forgotten world daring to fight back, deep in their hidden chambers. The syndicate's leaders argued among themselves. Some wanted him dead quickly before he became an uncontrollable symbol. Others wanted to capture him alive to sell to the highest bidder. In the end, greed won the argument. They decided to escalate the hunt. They released 2 more predators into the jungle, a pair of razor beasts with hides like black stone and tusks that could gore through armored vehicles. Alongside them, they dropped swarms of trackers, insect-like drones built to flush prey from hiding. The order was clear: drive the human into confrontation. Make the galaxy believe he was unstoppable, or break him in front of them. Either way, the ratings would climb. Kai knew something had changed when the forest grew quiet. Birds fled in sudden bursts, branches shook without wind, and the air carried a low vibration. He crouched low and whispered for the small alien to hide. The creature hesitated, then scrambled into a hollow. Kai gripped his staff and waited. The first tracker appeared, its thin frame cutting through leaves, wings buzzing like knives. It scanned the area with red eyes and sent signals back to the higher drones. Kai understood quickly that it was not built to fight, but to find. He smashed it with a sudden strike of his staff, crushing its body into sparks. More came, dozens of them, circling and darting like angry hornets. He swung again and again, moving with fierce precision until pieces of metal and wires littered the ground. Still, he knew the larger threat was coming. The razor beasts arrived with the sound of thunder. Their tusks tore through undergrowth, their massive bodies shaking the ground with every charge. They came as a pair, flanking, working together the way predators had learned over generations. The galaxy watching held its breath, certain that this would be the end. Kai stood tall, his chest rising with steady rhythm, and fixed his stance, the way he had against the Dreadmaw. He let the first beast charge, stepping aside at the last moment and driving his staff into its side. The impact slowed it, but did not stop it. The beast swung back with tusks that carved bark from trees. Kai rolled away, mud streaking his arms, his muscles burning with the effort. The second beast came from behind, tusks lowered to gore him. He planted the broken staff into the ground and vaulted over, landing hard on its back. He clung to the hide as it bucked and roared, his legs tightening like iron bands. He remembered cavalry drills from old Earth battles, remembered how soldiers had turned animals into war machines, and he used the same balance now, forcing the beast into confusion. Drones captured it all, broadcasting every strike, every movement, every breath. Commentators shouted over each other, unable to mask the shock. Across the stars, soldiers who had fought 100 battles leaned forward in silence. Families who had tuned in for entertainment now watched with awe and fear. Politicians whispered of new policies. Syndicate lords grinned at their profit but could not hide their unease. The human was no longer prey. He was turning the jungle itself into a weapon, bending every predator and every trap into proof that he could not be broken. At last, the first beast struck its companion by accident, tusks cutting deep into its flank. Both reeled, their coordination shattered. Kai used the moment to leap free, rolling into the mud and grabbing a jagged stone. He hurled it with perfect aim into the wounded beast's eye. The creature stumbled, roaring in pain, and crashed into the trees. The second staggered but lived, circling back with hate. Kai did not chase. He stood tall again, mud and blood streaking his body, his eyes hard as steel. He raised his broken staff and shouted into the jungle, his voice carrying not only to the beasts but to the galaxy above. He was not prey. He was man, and man would not fall far above. The drones spun, catching the image of a human standing defiant in the steaming mist, battered but unbowed. Billions watched with hearts racing. Some whispered in fear, some whispered in hope. And in that moment, Kai Mercer became more than a survivor. He became a symbol the galaxy could not ignore. The jungle night returned heavy with the cries of unseen creatures and the endless dripping of rain through the canopy. Kai Mercer moved slowly, his body aching from the fight with the razor beasts, every step reminding him of bruises and cuts that burned in the damp air. He leaned on his broken staff, not as a weakness, but as a tool to keep himself steady, because he knew more trials were coming. The drones hovered above, tireless eyes, feeding his struggle to the galaxy, their lenses glowing like cruel stars that never blinked. He did not know how many beings still watched, but he could feel their gaze on his back as if the entire universe pressed its weight upon him. In hidden halls of the Syndicate, the leaders drank in their success. Ratings had soared beyond every record, credits poured in, and across the Empire the name of the show Sovereign Wild was spoken by every tongue. Yet with success came fear. If this human continued to survive, he would become more than entertainment. He would become a challenge to their power. They decided the next stage must be greater still, a climax of spectacle and terror. They would release a night beast, a creature so rare and savage that few had even seen one alive. Twice the size of the Dreadmaw, armored with bone plates, eyes that glowed in the dark, and jaws that could tear through stone. It had been kept in cages for years, starved and enraged, waiting only to be unleashed. They would send it into the jungle with trackers and hounds, and they would broadcast every moment. The human would either fall in a storm of blood or rise into a legend beyond their control. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of the galaxy, whispers spread. Small groups of aliens who had watched in silence began to speak to one another. They had long hated the cruelty of the show but had feared to act. Now, seeing the human not only endure but show compassion to the weak, something stirred in them. In back alleys and encrypted channels, they spoke of forming a coalition to end Sovereign Wild. They shared the footage of Kai breaking the predator and freeing the small alien. They spoke of him not as a beast but as a warrior, a man carrying the spirit of defiance itself. A seed of rebellion began to grow, tiny yet dangerous. Kai found shelter near the base of a basalt cliff where water trickled into a shallow pool. He washed his wounds and bound his shoulder again with strips of torn jacket. The small alien he had rescued still followed him, watching with wide eyes as if unsure whether to fear or to trust. Kai handed it a piece of fruit from the tree above, and it accepted slowly, hunger defeating fear. In that quiet moment, Kai remembered faces from Earth, comrades who had fought and fallen, men and women who had laughed even in the shadow of death. He remembered the promise he had made never to let himself be chained again. He whispered to himself that he would not be their showpiece. He would not dance for their profit. He would fight not only for survival, but to shatter the cage they had built around him far above. The drones shifted suddenly, and Kai felt a change in the air. The jungle grew still, as if the creatures that lived there had fallen silent together. Then came a low rumble like the rolling of thunder underground. The ground trembled. Leaves shook loose from branches, and a foul smell spread on the wind, the stench of blood and old hunger. Kai gripped his staff tighter, his muscles tense despite exhaustion. The small alien hid behind the roots, its body shaking. From the shadows between the trees came two glowing eyes, pale and cruel, followed by a body that filled the forest path. The night beast had come. It stepped forward with a slow, heavy gait, each footfall sinking deep into the mud. Its hide was covered with thick bony plates that gleamed in the moonlight. Its jaws hung open, drooling strands of saliva that hissed when they touched the wet earth. Its roar shook the trees, scattering flocks of birds into the night sky. The drones captured every second, sending it out to billions who gasped and leaned closer to their screens. Commentators tried to keep their voices steady, but the fear in their tone was clear. This was no ordinary predator. This was death given. Kai's heart pounded, but his eyes stayed calm. He studied the beast the way a soldier studies the battlefield, seeing not only its size but its movement, its weight, The way its armor shifted when it stepped, the brief gaps in the plates near the neck and under the limbs. He knew brute strength alone would not win. He would need the jungle itself, the stones, the water, the storm still walking across the horizon. He whispered one word to himself, survive, and stepped forward to meet the monster. The night beast lowered its head, tusks gleaming, and charged with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. The ground shook, trees split apart, mud sprayed, into the air. Kai ran not away but toward the basalt cliff, forcing the beast to follow. His mind raced, his body screamed with pain, but he would not falter. Above, the drone spun wildly to catch the chase, and across the galaxy billions held their breath. The moment had come when human and monster would meet, and the outcome would decide not only the show, but perhaps the future of how the galaxy saw his kind. The cliff loomed ahead as Kai Mercer sprinted through the thick jungle, his body burning, with pain and exhaustion, yet his mind sharper than the edge of stone. Behind him, the night beast thundered forward, tearing down trees in its path, its roar shaking the very ground. The drones whirred above, capturing every second, their feeds flashing across the stars to billions who could not look away. To them, this was spectacle, but to Kai it was survival. It was defiance. It was the moment to prove that no cage could hold the spirit of a human. Kai reached the base of the basalt wall and turned sharply, his back pressed to the stone as the beast lunged. The tusks crashed into rock with a thunderclap, sending shards flying through the air. Kai ducked low, rolling to the side, his shoulder screaming in pain as he hit the ground. He rose quickly, eyes fixed on the gaps in the beast's armor he had studied earlier. He knew he could not match its strength head-on, so he would use the cliff, the mud, the storm, and every ounce of cunning that had kept him alive so far. The beast turned with frightening speed, its glowing eyes burning with rage. And charged again. Kai ran not away but upward, climbing the jagged slope of the cliff with bleeding hands gripping cracks and edges. The drones followed, struggling to keep sight as rain began to fall again, sheets of water drumming against stone. The beast slammed, its tusks into the cliff, shaking the ground so hard that Kai nearly lost his grip. He climbed higher, forcing the monster to follow, knowing its size would be its weakness across the galaxy. Silence filled halls and ships as beings of every kind watched the human climb in defiance of death. Soldiers in distant barracks leaned forward, their hearts pounding. Counselors whispered to one another that humanity was not to be underestimated. Syndicate leaders cursed and laughed in equal measure, their greed fed by the spectacle but their fear growing with every second the human refused to die. In dark corners of the galaxy, small coalitions of rebels replayed the feed, whispering that this was the symbol they had waited for, a reminder that even the greatest empire could be resisted. Kai reached a ledge halfway up the cliff and pulled himself onto it, his chest heaving with every breath. The night beast clawed at the stone below, its tusks carving great gouges, its roars echoing like thunder. It began to climb, slow but unstoppable, pulling its massive body upward. Kai searched the ledge and found a slab of rock loosened by rain and time. He set his shoulder to it, every muscle in his body straining, his teeth clenched as he shoved. The stone groaned, shifted, and then broke free, tumbling down with a crash. It struck the beast squarely across the head, cracking one of its bony plates. The beast roared in fury, blood dark and thick spilling from the wound. But still it climbed. Kai knew the rock would not be enough. He looked higher, saw another ledge above that could serve as a killing ground, and began to climb again. His fingers bled, his body trembled, but he did not stop. The rain lashed at him, the wind whipped his hair into his eyes, yet he forced himself upward. The beast followed, relentless, its claws finding purchase where none should exist. It would not stop until one of them fell at last. Kai reached the higher ledge and pulled himself onto it. Collapsing for a moment, his lungs burning, he rose again, leaning on his broken staff, and looked down at the monster. It was close now, its eyes glowing, its mouth open wide. He felt no fear. He felt only the steady calm of a soldier who had faced death before and refused to yield. He whispered to himself that this would end here, one way or another. The beast lunged, dragging itself onto the ledge, and Kai struck with all his strength. He jammed the broken staff into the wound where the plate had cracked, driving it deep with a roar of his own. The beast thrashed, its tusks slicing the air, but Kai held firm, his entire body pushing down. The staff splintered, but the wound widened, blood pouring over his arms. The monster slammed against him, driving him back toward the edge, but he twisted, using its weight against itself, forcing it toward the drop. With a final heave, he shoved, and the beast toppled, its claws scraping stone as it fell into the darkness below. The impact shook the cliff, sending a shockwave through the ground. The jungle fell silent again. Kai stood above, shaking, blood mixing with rain, his breath ragged. He looked down at the broken body of the beast below, then up at the drones that hovered close. He raised no weapon, he gave no victory cry. He simply stared, his eyes steady and unbroken, daring the galaxy to see him not as prey but as man. Across the stars, billions felt a chill. The Syndicate had wanted a spectacle of death. Instead, they had created a legend, and legends were harder to kill than any beast. Kai turned from the edge and looked toward the horizon where the jungle spread endless and dark. He knew the fight was not over. The Syndicate would not stop, not while Prophet remained, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer fought only to survive. He fought to break the chains of the game itself, to tear down the spire that broadcast his suffering, to end the hunt not only for him but for every creature forced into it. His path was clear now, and though his body ached and bled, his spirit burned brighter than ever. The storm rolled above, lightning tearing across the sky, and in that storm, Kai Mercer walked forward, ready for the final reckoning that waited. Ahead, the storm raged across the sky as Kai Mercer moved through the jungle with heavy steps, his body battered from the long battles, yet his spirit steady as stone. The drones still followed, their endless eyes capturing every moment. But Kai no longer felt their gaze as chains. Now he carried the weight of purpose. He was no longer surviving for himself. He was moving toward the spire, the tall iron tower hidden deep in the jungle, the source that carried Sovereign Wild to the galaxy. If he could bring it down, the endless cycle of death and spectacle would fall with it. He tightened the strip of cloth around his bleeding arm and pressed on. The small alien he had rescued still trailed him, its tiny limbs quick despite the rain and mud. It looked to him with trust now, no longer trembling in fear, and Kai felt a strange warmth at its presence. It reminded him of the comrades he had once sworn to protect, the faces of his old unit who had stood against impossible odds. He whispered that he would not let this creature fall into the same cruelty he had endured. He would see it safe, even if it cost him his life far away in the gilded chambers of the Syndicate. The leaders shouted at one another as reports poured in. The human was moving toward the spire. If he reached it, their empire of profit would collapse in flames. Some demanded that he be killed at once with orbital strikes. Others wanted him captured alive no matter the cost. Yet greed still held them back. The ratings were beyond anything they had dreamed. Every breath the human took, every drop of blood was worth mountains of credits. They decided to let the show play to the very end. They armed the spire's defenses, filled the jungle with machines, and prepared the final test. Either the human would fall live on every screen, or he would become the legend they could never control. Kai pressed forward through flooded ground until the trees thinned and the spire rose ahead, black against the lightning sky. It was a tower of steel and signal, guarded by drones with weapons and crawling machines built to tear intruders apart. He crouched low, studying the movements, his mind sharpening into the soldier's calm he had known in countless battles before. He whispered to the small alien to stay hidden among the roots, and it obeyed, watching with wide eyes as the human prepared to face an army alone. The machines came first, skittering across the mud on metal limbs, their eyes glowing red. Kai lifted. A fallen branch sharpened to a point and met them head-on. He moved with precision, striking at joints, rolling into mud to avoid the blast of energy bolts, shoving one machine into another until sparks lit the rain-soaked air. He fought with the patience of a predator and the fury of a soldier, his body moving like a weapon forged by years of hardship. One by one, the machines fell broken at his feet, their pieces scattered across the ground. The drones above spun faster, trying to capture every angle, the commentators losing their calm voices as they shouted about the impossible spectacle. At last Kai reached the base of the spire, his chest heaving, his skin streaked with blood and rain. He stared up at the tower, lightning flashing behind it, and knew this was the moment. If he struck it down, the galaxy would see the truth. He climbed the outer frame, hands slipping on wet steel, muscles screaming, but he would not stop. Alarms blared, turrets turned and fired, but he moved like a shadow, leaping from girder to girder, tearing wires free, ripping open panels with bleeding hands. He remembered the promise he had made never to be their prey again, and with a roar, he drove the sharpened branch into the heart of the power core. The tower erupted in a burst of light, the signal shattering across the sky. Screens across the galaxy went dark. The endless stream of sovereign wild cut short. For a moment there was silence, the first true silence in years for those who had lived under the noise of the spectacle. Billions stared at black screens, their breath caught in their throats, realizing that the human had broken the cage in the jungle the spire burned, sparks raining down as the tower fell in pieces. Kai staggered down from the wreckage, his body nearly broken but his eyes still steady. He found the small alien waiting and lifted it into his arms. Together they walked away from the ruins, the storm breaking at last, moonlight shining through the clouds. The drones that remained hovered aimlessly, their purpose gone, their feeds cut. For the first time, Kai felt free of their gaze. Across the stars, the effect was immediate. The syndicate collapsed in chaos, its leaders fleeing as riots broke out in their strongholds. The council convened an emergency, fearful of what humanity might become now that the galaxy had seen one of them defy the impossible. And in quiet corners the whispers grew louder, the coalitions gaining strength inspired by the human who had refused to be broken. Kai walked deeper into the jungle, his steps slow but steady, his spirit burning brighter than any flame. He did not know what the galaxy would decide about him or his kind. He only knew that he had fought not just for survival, but for freedom, and that he had won. He looked once at the horizon, then at the small creature in his arms, and whispered that no cage would ever hold them again. The jungle closed behind him, the storm faded, and a new dawn began to rise. The story of the human had ended, but the legend had only just begun. The fires of the fallen spire still glowed against the night sky while smoke curled upward to mix with the fading storm. Kai Mercer stood among the ruins with his body broken in places yet unbent in spirit. He looked at the jungle stretching endless around him, no longer a prison but a place of freedom. The drones that had once circled him like vultures now drifted, without purpose, their signals severed, their masters powerless. For the first time since he had been thrown into the hunt, he was free of their eyes, and the silence that followed was not emptiness but peace. The small alien clung to his shoulder, its bright eyes watching the horizon where the first light of dawn began to rise. Kai knew he had shattered more than a tower. He had broken the chains of a system that fed on suffering, a system that believed nothing could resist its grip. Across the galaxy, people sat before blank screens, and in that darkness they understood something the syndicate had never meant to show them. They understood that one human had fought not only to live but to defy and to win. In the halls of power, leaders argued in panic, some demanding humans be hunted and controlled, others whispering that it was too late, that fear had already become respect. In the streets of 100 worlds, voices that had once been silent rose with courage. They spoke of rebellion, of breaking chains, of the will to fight no matter the odds. The legend of Kai Mercer spread faster than any broadcast the AI syndicate had ever sent. He had become a symbol carried in whispers and songs, a reminder that strength was not only claws and tusks but also the unyielding will to stand when no one believed it possible. Kai did not hear the arguments or the songs. He walked deeper into the jungle with steady steps, his body weary but his purpose clear. The small alien rested safely in his arms as he moved toward the rising sun. He felt the weight of the galaxy behind him, but he carried it as a soldier carries his pack, heavy yet familiar, never enough to bend his back. He had no plan for where the path would lead, but he knew it was his path, not one chosen by the syndicate, not one forced upon him by watchers or masters. For the first time since his capture, he belonged only to himself. The jungle opened into a valley bright with morning. Birds called from the branches, rivers shone with silver light, and the air smelled of rain and life rather than blood and fear. Kai breathed deeply and let the moment settle into him. He had been prey, he had been spectacle, he had been caged, but now he was none of those things. He was a man who had survived, who had fought, and who had won. He whispered to the alien that they would keep walking, that they would find safety, that no cage would ever hold them again. His voice was steady, his eyes sharp, and his steps strong. The jungle closed behind him and the valley opened before him, and with each stride he carried not just himself, but the hope of countless others who had seen what he had done. Somewhere, far away, the galaxy whispered his name. But here in the quiet he was only Kai Mercer. Soldier. Survivor. Human. He moved toward the dawn without fear, ready for whatever waited beyond the horizon. The end.